All right, let's get started. So I'm Gayle Laakmann McDowell. I'm the author of Cracking the Coding Interview, as well as Cracking the PM Interview, which is what I actually meant to say. And I'm here to talk about how to do well in PM interviews. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to think about getting a job as a PM, how to think about your background, and then I'm going to switch into mostly interview questions. But the two things are actually very much tied hand in hand. So first, a little bit of my background. I was at Google for a while. My background's in computer science. I was at Google for a while, a bit at Microsoft and Apple as well, was on Google's hiring committee, did a ton of interviewing there, and then wrote Cracking the Coding Interview and Cracking the PM Interview, as well as Cracking the Tech Career. And then what I do now is mostly consulting. So there's two types of consulting. One is what I call acquisition interview consulting, which what that means is that when startups go through acquisitions, they get interviewed just like a typical candidate would, more or less interviewing for their own jobs. And so I get brought in by startups to help people prepare for those interviews. The other thing I do is the other side and help companies think about how to build out a hiring process. So I'm going to talk about both of those here today a bit because they actually are very much related to thinking about how to interview well. One of the things I've gotten the ability to see is the ability to interview the same person repeatedly and see what kind of things help them prepare, what kind of things, when someone does badly in this way, what kind of things can you do to help them actually improve how they do time after time. So, oops, that went the wrong way. My slides there. So feel free to take pictures. I know that's how people record information on slides. That's fine. The slides are online, though. You can go to go.gayle.com/PMPrepSlides, and that'll give you, the slides. Even easier, just shoot me an email, gayle@gayle.com with the subject PM Prep. That has to be one word, and that'll give you just an auto response to the slides and a few other things as well. Okay, so again, subject is PM Prep and it's gayle@gayle.com. Okay, so first of all, just clarifying definitions. Product manager. When I say PM, I mean product manager. That also includes associate product managers, which is a entry-level rotation program that a lot of the bigger companies have, and a few smaller companies as well. I'm not going to refer to project managers or program managers. Those are really different roles, although they are also often called PMs. That said, at Microsoft, the terms are a little different than how everybody else uses them. So at Microsoft, their program manager role is most closely equivalent to a product manager. And their product manager role is most closely associated with, is most closely related to a product marketing manager. But for the most part, we're not talking about program managers. We're talking about product managers. So what a PM does is, they're responsible for the product. They are managing the product. They're not managing the actual employees. You're not managing the developers, though your job is to inspire them, direct them, lead them, but without, typically, most companies, actual decision-making power over them. So you're thinking about things like who are the users, what do they want, what are the features they want, how are you going to launch, when are you going to launch? You're directing a lot of these decisions in conjunction with a lot of other people at the company. So you're working very hands in hand. You're working very much with other roles. That could be marketing, that could be sales, certainly developers. So today what I'm going to talk about is a bit about what the perfect PM is, what that looks like. And then I'm going to go into interview questions. That's going to be talking mostly about behavioral questions, product design questions. And then I'll talk a little bit about estimation questions and case questions and some other types at the end. So first, the perfect PM. The perfect PM would have all these categories. They would have technical skills. So that means coding or at least really understanding technology very, very well. That means having product skills, certainly. So being able to think about the user and what they want. Business skills, so that's the kind of things like, marketing frameworks and these sort of things. You're able to actually lead and execute on things. And then industry skills. And what I mean by industry skills is that if you're applying for a PM position at a company that does something related to finance, industry skills would be a background in finance. That said, it's a myth. pretty much nobody has all of these skills. It's certainly not equally balanced. It's really, really hard because if you have coding skills, if you're entering as a PM at least, and you have coding skills, that's because you're just a software engineer probably, and that makes it unlikely for you to also have business skills and industry skills. So for the most part, when people enter a PM role, they don't have all these roles, and that means that when you're thinking about getting your first job as a PM, and you're thinking, I don't have some of these, well, you know what? Neither do all the other candidates. No one really has all of these categories. Your job as a candidate is to think about what skills do you actually have of those kind of 5 big buckets. What do you need? What does the role require? What is the company going to particularly care about? And then this other thing that a lot of people forget about, which is what am I going to assume about you? And when I say that, I'm talking about what stereotypes are people going to apply to you. And I'm not just talking about racial or gender stereotypes, although that's in there too. What I'm actually really talking about is what assumptions are people going to make based on your background. So if you're coming in as you're just a software developer, people are probably going to assume you have technical skills. They're probably going to have a good bet that you're probably okay with numbers and data. But are you somebody who can work with other people? Are you somebody who can, think about what, do a little bit in the direction of product design? Well, that's not the kind of thing that's usually associated with developers. On the other hand, if you're entering product management and you are just, and you're entering from being a UI designer, people are going to assume you probably can think about users. You probably can think about what makes a attractive, easy to use product. But they're going to maybe question your ability to be technical or to use data. That doesn't mean that these stereotypes are true about you and your background. In many cases, they aren't. But they are stereotypes nonetheless that people have about you. And when you think about how to introduce yourself and how to tackle behavioral questions, you want to think about, hey, these things I need to have, and people are going to assume that I have them. And these other things I have, but people are going to think I don't. And so you really want to think about how do you introduce and make it clear to the interviewer that actually you have these skills unexpectedly. So with that, let's talk about behavioral questions and specifically that kind of pitch. So a lot of interviews start off with talking about your background and just you introducing yourself. So, you can think about a good enough pitch. So that's going to be, start my timer. That's going to be about 2 minutes typically, and it usually just walks through your resume. That's kind of the good enough pitch. The way you do this is you start off with where you are right now. I'm a product manager, I'm a UX designer or whatever at such company. Drop back to the beginning of your career. So 1 or 2 sentences about where you are right now, and then go way back to the beginning and then work forward from there. Sometimes people fall into this trap where after they say where they are right now, they start talking a lot of details about where they were, about that company, where they currently are. And then they end up winding this thing where they start going backwards, and then the last thing they say is like what they did in college, which is not, it doesn't really leave the interviewer with the best impression. It makes the last thing you talk about, stuff that doesn't even matter very much. So you want to, be clear on 1 or 2 sentences about where you are right now, and my background's in this, and then that's how you move forward from there. Think about quick ways you can demonstrate success. And so what that means is stuff like launching a feature, some awards, stuff like that. But it also means just things that show that you've been successful. So a simple line like somebody says, and blah, 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 I worked at this company for this number of years, and I left when my old manager recruited me out to join his startup. A line like that, is not that subconsciously, fairly consciously, tells the interviewer, hey, you were good enough at that last role that your old manager really wanted you to work for them. That is not an accomplishment per se. It's not an accomplishment that you were recruited out, but it is a demonstration of success. So think about how you can show that you've been successful in the past. Think about what stories do you want to get the opportunity to talk about and drive the interviewer that direction. You can say things like, and I worked a lot on re-architecting the system, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later on. And something like that gives the interviewer a cue to say, hey, maybe I want to ask these questions to you. And that is a great thing for me as the interviewer as well. I want to talk about the interesting best stuff. I don't want to talk about random things that aren't particularly relevant or impressive. I want you to get the opportunity to talk about the best stuff. And then lastly, think about your hobbies. I think this is an area where, some people, I'd say a chunk of people just always talk about hobbies, and there's a chunk of people who just don't. And it almost doesn't have a lot of relation to who should and shouldn't talk about it. Hobbies, when in doubt, talk about your hobbies. It won't, for the most part, hurt you. It's generally hard to find a hobby that is detrimental to talking about, and if it is, you probably know that already and you know not to talk about it. But a lot of people have hobbies that actually could be impressive, but they don't think about how to frame them. So for example, one guy I was working with is really into running, which is it's not really, unless you're interviewing for a role that's maybe like in a fitness app or something like that, that's not a particularly relevant thing. And he was interviewing for Apple, so it wasn't particularly relevant to his role. And so he didn't talk about the fact that he is really passionate about running. As it turns out, though, he had signed up for a 100-mile ultramarathon, which is actually running 100 miles, which is insane. And in the actual race, after all that training, he ended up not finishing, which is part of why he didn't feel like he should talk about it, because he failed. He only ran 60 miles. And the reason why he quit was about halfway through the 60 miles, around mile 30, he hurt his ankle. So this guy ran 30 miles, hurt his ankle, ran another 30 miles, and then was finally like, this is probably actually medically unsound to do. And that's why he finally gave up. And he saw this as either not relevant or actually a failure. And actually what it does when you explain what happened and what you did to the interviewers, it shows, like, you look at that guy and he's not lazy. Right? He clearly has the ability to work incredibly hard and to be really, really persistent day after day, because that requires an insane amount of training. He's not a lazy guy, right? And he's not somebody who gives up easily. And when he's thinking about a role at Apple, hard work, persistence, not giving up, those are very, very relevant things. The running isn't, that doesn't matter. But the persistence and not giving up, even when you have a very, very good reason to give up, that's actually incredibly relevant. So think about your hobbies in that perspective. How do they show creativity, leadership, ability to learn, anything like that? What attributes do they show, even if the hobby specifically isn't relevant? And bring those attributes out. So that's kind of the good enough pitch as you go through that stuff. The clicker does not work well. Okay. The really great pitches tell a real story. They have something, what is it that drives you? So that might be something about a very particular interest you have, like a passion around music. And maybe somehow passion around music or mentorship or something like that has really been the driving force in your career. Or maybe it's something different. Maybe what you really love is figuring out hard problems. Maybe that is the piece that really drives your career. The great pitches have that story. They don't just like, I did this and I did this and I did this. They have a real story to them. And then they also have this message. They have this thing where you're saying, these are the driving things about me as a product manager. And those things can be very explicit. So I've seen people start off pitches pitches are just introductions with just, I'm, Bob, I'm a product manager at such and such a company. And what brought me into product management is the drive to build teams and mentor, and also while making impact on the world. So I started off my career as doing computer science in college because I wanted to learn how things are made. And I felt like learning how things are made is going to be the key to making an impact on the world. And then he drives through that pitch that way. So think about if there's clear themes that tie your background and bringing those out. And then also they address your stereotype. So one person I was prepping, this was an acquisition situation. So he's the CEO of a company, but it was a very, 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 very small company. And these are acqui-hires, so it's not, that is going through an acquisition is not necessarily a clear like, the company must be really successful. You can debate it, but it's kind of in the middle of the road or maybe less successful because the product wasn't doing well. Anyway, so he's the CEO of a company, had one employee, beautiful product, never got any traction. His background as he's introducing himself is he was an artist for a while, and then he went back to school, I think got a degree in HCI, human computer interfaces, then was a UX designer, and then started this company. Right? Very clear that he's a great UX designer. But you hear that and you're like, but can he Can he really be a business person like a PM needs to be? Maybe not. And as I started working with him on his pitch, he actually could be. He could be the business person. He's very data-driven. But his initial pitch was like, you know, I think maybe we should re-interview you for UX designer because you're an artist. You're not the person who can make hard business decisions. And he could, but that wasn't coming out initially. And so what he did was he shifted his pitch over to talk a lot more about, yes, the basics were still in there, that he was an artist and HCI, that was still all in there. So it's still abundantly clear that like he knows how to make pretty products. But he shifted his pitch and what the stories are he talked about data and making hard decisions and leadership. And it came off as, he ended up shifting things to come off as this really, really well-rounded PM. And so you want to think about that in your pitch. What assumptions am I going to make about you? And if they're not true, correct them. Some of those stereotypes are good, but some of them are not, and correct the ones that maybe aren't so good. Okay, so the other thing to think about with your stories are, who are you and what have you done? So the other side of behavioral stuff is the actual behavioral question. So tell me about a time when you led a team. Tell me about a time when you did such and such, influenced somebody. So one of the keys to this is to have just a bunch of stories ready. So before your interview, these are kind of the 5 major categories of questions: leadership, successes, challenges, mistakes, failures. And then go make this little grid, and then for each column, that's each kind of chunk of your resume. So that'll be every job. If you've had discrete roles within a company, you might have that multiple, different times, that company up here. But build out this grid and try to fill in this grid with one story for every job, for every kind of cell there. Now, realistically, there's going to be some overlap. It's really hard, if you have 5 jobs, to have come up with 5 different stories. But try to have as many different stories in there as possible, and that'll help you a lot when your interview asks you, what did you, even something that's not on this list, like tell me something you learned from this job. It'll be a lot easier for you to think about like, oh, okay, I can give that mistake, failure, and that's going to be also something I learned. So it'll be a lot easier for you to find stories that way. So come up with a bunch of stories like this. The other way that I found to be really useful for coming up with stories is actually to start with your strengths and failures, or strengths and weaknesses. I actually don't love this as an interview question, as an interviewer. I do ask it when I prep people because a lot of other interviewers ask it, and it is worthwhile to be prepared for that. I don't like it as an interview question, but from the perspective of coming up with stories, it's actually really useful. You can find, there's one in my book, but there's also a lot online, just lists of strengths and weaknesses. And go through that and which ones jump out at you? And then can you come up with a story that shows that? And what's really nice about those is that those stories have a very clear thing that I'm going to learn from that story. So you came up with that story because it was an example of risk-taking. And now when you tell me that story, that's going to be very clear. I'm going to say, oh, okay, great. He's a person who can take risk. So start from that perspective. Or you come up with, you're saying, you're very thorough. So you come up with a story that's based on that, and it's going to be very clear that I'm going to look at you and say, oh, she's someone who is very thorough. She covers all the details. That's wonderful. We need somebody like that. As opposed to a lot of stories where there's something that happened. I told you, yes, okay, oh, you did a great job. And I'm like, okay, but how does this affect my perception of you as a candidate? When you start with the attributes, the perception I get is very clear. So it's a great way of coming up with stories. And I recommend both of these paths simultaneously. So then the other piece is how to answer the question. So when you think about these questions, there's the content itself. That's where coming up with stories is really useful. And then there's the structuring of the actual content. So what I recommend is using your answer. It should, of course, answer the actual question being asked, more or less. It should deliver a positive message about you. And that positive message, something that makes me think you're a better candidate, is absolutely true on weaknesses and failure questions as well, and mistakes. Those can all actually send me a better message of you as a candidate. But they should also be well structured. And that last piece is something that's very much in your control. Even if you don't have a great answer from a content perspective, you can still show good structure. So what that means is state the nugget first, and then situation, action, response, or result. So nugget first, what this means is the first thing you say is the answer to the question. Tell me about a time when you made a mistake. Sure, let me tell you about the time when I delivered feedback poorly to one of my employees. And now I know what the point of this answer is. And what this means is that if you start talking about this other thing and your CEO gave you this direction to do this thing, you give me details I don't really need to know, I can slot that information much more easily in my head and your answer doesn't come off as disorganized. But also, it actually forces you to be more organized, or at least encourage you to be more organized, because you know what you're trying to talk about. You're trying to talk about that one time when you gave feedback, and you're less likely to give unnecessary details. The other piece that goes very much hand in hand with this is SAR, which a lot of people have probably heard about before. There's a very closely related thing called STAR. But this is basically situation, action, result. So what was the issue, what did you do about it, and what was the impact? Very simple, and usually you do both of these. So the other piece here is what's the message? And this is the thing that I'd say people make the biggest mistake in interviews on is they don't think about what the actual point of their answer is. And what I'll do when I prep people is they'll give me their answer and I'll ask them, okay, so what adjectives should I have learned about you from this answer? And more often than not, they can't really tell me. They're like, well, it shows that I, launched this product. Okay, so that shows me you are a what kind of person? What description am I giving you now? So you want to really think about what label should I apply to you now? What description did I learn about you? So the three big mistakes I see on these questions, one is that no message thing. It's a good answer in the sense of like, okay, so you had a good accomplishment, whatever, but I didn't actually learn anything about you. I didn't learn that you're more persistent, risk-taking, whatever. The other big thing that happens is there's too little action. So there's a situation, action, result. A lot of people give a ton of detail on situation, and then they just basically skim right over the action. So it's, sure, so I asked them something like, tell me about a challenge you faced or something difficult at your job, and someone gives me this answer, and it's like, well, I had the situation where a supplier was late on something that would create a delay for our buyers, blah, blah, blah. And there's all this detail about the stuff. And it ended up causing a lot of problems for our buyers. So I went and I emailed everybody, told them what was going on. And then in the end, we lost one customer, kept the others. Okay. So I believe that it was a stressful situation. I believe it was challenging for your company. But what I learned about this candidate was they emailed people. Okay. So you can use email, but what did you really do about this problem? Very little. And when I got more into the details, it turns out that there was a lot more going on there. They thought about who do we email first? And actually not everybody's emailed. This one customer, they were called because they have the person has a more personal relationship with that product manager, and getting an email would come off kind of rude. And so that person, they knew that they would really appreciate a phone call. And this other person was really data-driven, and so they, came up with a lot of data and gave a lot of facts about the situation, tell them what was going on. And so when you peel back the layers, there's all this other action that this product manager took, but the surface level thing at first was just, I wrote an email, which doesn't help anybody. So when you think about your answers, think about, can your action be broken down into at least 3 bullets, or ideally 3 bullets exactly? And if it can't do that, there's probably not enough detail there. So those 3 bullets can be, I approached it 3 different ways, or I thought about the problem from 3 different perspectives. I took these 3 steps. Think about, does your actions have 3 bullets to it? If it doesn't, you're probably light on details. Okay, and then the third thing, the third really, really common mistake that's extremely common for product managers, as well as anyone in leadership capacities, is a lot of we instead of I. So, and this is very natural because as a product manager or as a leader, you're trained to not talk a lot about yourself. At least when it comes to good stuff, it should be, oh, the team did such a great job. Failures, yes, you use I. And then people translate this to an interview where they start saying, well, we had this issue and we looked at a couple different things and we convened a meeting and we talked about a couple different options and I'm like, okay, so you could have been fetching coffee and that's still a we. You were still there in the room, part of it. I have no idea what you were doing. So listen carefully in your answers. Are you saying we or I? It should be, for the most part, I. You should not say we a whole lot in your answers. It'll happen, but not a whole lot. Pay attention especially to the beginning of your answers. What I find is that when people start off with we in the beginning of their answers, that usually sets the pattern for the rest of the answer. So pay really careful attention. If you're saying we, make sure that it really was truly everybody, and there isn't something that was really more I. And if it is really truly everybody, it maybe isn't a good story anyway, because now I don't know what you did. So even when it's leading a team and whatever, like it's about you leading the team. It's not about what the team did. It's about how you led the team, how you interacted, how you solved problems. So focus on what wording you're using there. Okay, and then merge these all together. You come up with your 5 stories. You should have at least I'd say 5 stories. Come up with those 5 stories and break those down across, the nugget. Have the situation, the action, the result, the message, and then also think about what you do differently. Have all your stories diagrammed like this. Last thing I'll say about behavioral questions is the bad stuff. So failures, mistakes, things like that. These are not answers that make you look worse. Some people look at these questions as like, uh-oh, I got asked about my mistakes or failures. Like, how can I make myself look the least bad here? And it really shouldn't be that way. And when people do that, what ends up happening is they try to sugarcoat things, and that's the exact opposite. When I do interviewer training, and I ask people, a lot of people ask kind of about failures, mistakes, and I ask people, okay, so what are you looking at? What exactly are you looking for there? One, half of interviewers can't actually tell me what they're looking for, which is a problem. But the other half who tell me what they're looking for, the number one thing is they want to see that people can admit to failures. That's what so when you're sugarcoating it and trying to make it sound less bad, like you're doing the opposite of what you're making yourself look worse. They want to see that you can admit to failures. They want to see that you can admit to mistakes, that you can actually personalize it, admit to what you personally did wrong, and that you solved the problem and you tried to find a solution, or that you learned things, that you became a different person. When you sugarcoat it, you actually make yourself look a lot worse. There are occasionally answers that people give when I do interview training, when I do interview coaching, which is like, yeah, that just don't give that answer like that. And that's when it's stuff like anything that's like an ethical violation, like that's hard to recover from. I mean, maybe sometimes, but it's just so dangerous. But for the most part, people's answers are not bad enough. Make your mistakes real. So what people are looking for, if you'll admit to bad stuff, if you really failed is the other thing. There's a belief that if you've had the opportunity to have an impact, you've also had the opportunity to fail. So if you haven't failed, you haven't made an impact. And then how you respond to things. So you want to make sure you get out all this information. Again, these stories can absolutely and should, every story you give should make you look better. It has the opportunity to do that, and you want to think about these in the same way. These are stories where you can make yourself look better. And the way you do that is be real. It should be a real story. You should be open about it, especially for, I don't want to go too much into gender stuff here, but especially for men. You can afford, women, it's more dangerous, just completely honestly, to be emotionally vulnerable. That can backfire on a woman. It's not saying you can't make that choice, but that can backfire. For men, for the most part, you can actually afford to be a little bit more emotionally vulnerable, particularly when you're talking about something that was bad, right? You're talking about a time when you screwed up your company, when you screwed up a coworker's life, right? Like, that should be stuff that is emotionally affecting you. I'm not saying go start crying in the interview, but it should be something where it's not a completely stoic response, right? You fired somebody. You messed up their life. That should be something that is a little bit upsetting to you. And it's okay to admit to that. You don't have to pretend to be completely stoic. Yeah. I haven't seen women be too emotionally vulnerable. I think women are generally more emotionally open in the first place, so for a variety of cultural reasons. So they don't need to bring that level up, and doing that might backfire. It's more that men tend to have been raised to hide emotions, and I'm saying, it's okay. You can be open, you can admit that firing somebody was hard on you, and that it was really upsetting, and that's a good thing to admit to that. And then the stuff should have changed you. right? The point of the story is to show how they changed you. You should have changed. You should have learned something. You should learn that you should now do something different, and you want to admit to that stuff. Okay. So if you had everything else here, know who you are and what we're going to assume about you. Focus on the user. I didn't talk a ton about that yet, but I will shortly. Focus on the user. And that's going to come up when you're talking about behavioral questions like getting into like how you designed a product. You want to make that user piece very, very clear. I'll talk about that much more later. And then structure your answers. Even if you can't give an answer with great content, at least you can structure it effectively and show that you're a structured communicator. Okay, next section I want to talk about is product design. So this along with behavioral questions are kind of the meat of what a lot of PM questions are. And these can come up in a couple different ways. One is something like, how would you design, this product? How would you design a pen? How would you design an alarm clock for the blind? A lot of these product design questions have some particular user assigned to it. And for some reason, it's often people with disabilities. But it can also be children or something, elderly people, something like that. Then there's favorite app. What's your favorite app? Favorite mobile app? Favorite website? Things like that. And then there's, pick in this case I said Google, if it's a Google interview. If you're not interviewing for Google, you probably would not be asked about your favorite Google product, unless maybe you're coming from Google, but pick a product from whatever the current company you're interviewing for, and how would you improve that? So what people are looking for here is communication. That's there in all the interviews. User empathy. So are you a person who really, really understands the users? Creativity to some extent, but bounded by business judgment. So sometimes people will be asked these questions about like, how would you design a pen? And they come up with something that's just like, it's a cool idea, I guess, but it's like outrageous. Like this is just, it doesn't make business sense to be putting like a bunch of Bluetooth on a pen and this and that. And it's just like, come on, this is not actually a wise business decision. Creativity is cool, but not when it leads you off to some crazy idea. And then product insight. So first thing, how to design a product. So you could ask something like, how do you design a, let's say a pen. So one of the first things you want to do is ask questions. Approach every product question, and arguably every question in general, other than maybe behavioral questions, as you find questions to ask. There's something that's ambiguous, figure out what it is and ask it. Does not literally mean every single question has ambiguity, but it's there more often than not. And one of the things interviewers often look for is, do you ask follow-up questions or do you make assumptions? So have your mindset be, you're going to ask questions off the bat. And then you're going to come up with a structure. You're going to identify the users. That is incredibly important to identify the users. That's like the point of being a PM is you know who the users are, you think about them, and you think about their use cases and problems and goals, and you think about these things, and then you go and create a product for them. And that's what you want to do here. And use the whiteboard. Generally speaking, you're going to be interviewed in a room with a whiteboard. If you don't have a whiteboard, you probably have paper. Use that. It is there for your benefit. So, in fact, one thing you may want to do just to really get in the mindset is when you get asked a question, just immediately go to the whiteboard. Even if you don't know how you're going to use it yet, just if you're up there, you're a lot more likely to use it, and that's likely to benefit you. So, yeah.
So are you writing down your questions, or are you?
For the using the whiteboard, what you do is you may use it to think about the structure. But certainly when you're talking about product, so you may do some stuff about the structure, about like, here are the 3 types of users and here are their use cases. So you might use the whiteboard for that. And in a product design question, often you'll end up sketching a layout or kind of a picture of the product, and that's certainly when you'll want the whiteboard for that. If all else fails, don't forget about the users. This is the thing, I'm going to come back to this over and over again. The user is the point of being a PM. If you don't show that you're a person who makes a user top priority, that's kind of the point of your job. So that's going to be hard to get a job after that. So keep the user really, really important there. So let's talk about how to design a bookcase for children. Who's the user? Children? Okay, great. So where do we go from here? What's that? Age is children. Yes, exactly. Children is have an 18-year range. that's not one user. That is many, many, many types of users, and you want to figure out who you're signing for. And so you want to ask the interviewer, what age children are we talking about here? And by the way, I'm going to talk most about candidate stuff, but for people who are interviewing as interviewers in the room, don't ask questions about children. It's really unfair, actually, because people who are parents understand this so much better than people who are not parents, and it's wildly unfair and also gets into actually probably discriminatory zones around having children, gender, et cetera. And I've seen this when I've asked, and I do ask questions like this in prepping because interviewers do, and I've seen the difference between people who have kids and people who don't. And especially like the ages of kids, people who have like young kids are gonna understand like that 1-year-old is very different from a 4-year-old when you're talking about designing a pen. And the person who has a much older kid might have forgotten about that. So don't ask questions about children. But for candidates, you want to prep around that. So yeah, children, that's a really big age range. Are we talking about, 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 10-year-olds? That's very different. And even there, who are we talking about? Is this going to be used in a school, in a home, somewhere else, I don't know, kid activity area? These are all kind of different things. So you want to keep that user really, really important and really think, do I really understand everything about how this thing is getting used? And then from there, you start going into, okay, so what are the major things they're going to do? Their major things are going to be to find books. Well, and again, this is where it's unfair for people who don't have children. A 2-year-old is going to identify books by their cover. A 10-year-old is going to identify books by the letters. So that's actually a different bookcase you want to design around. Are the covers exposed, things like that? How high can you put it? Is the bookcase safe from toppling over, things like that? But you go through and you talk about from there, once you get the users outlined, you go through and talk about their major use cases, what the problems are you going to solve, and then you actually come up with solutions for that. And then there's improving a product. So one of, and this approach is very, very similar. You're going to talk about what the goals of the product. I mean, the only difference is really you're not designing from scratch. So you're going to be talking a little about what the current problems are, but it's still the same thing about users. So one of my favorite questions to ask candidates when I prep is how would you improve the US Postal Service? And what I see is a lot of people, I'd say most people identify it as a product question, but then they kind of forget about this whole user thing. There are users, of course, for the US Postal Service. And there's many different ways of breaking it down. You can think about business versus consumer. You can think about sending versus receiving. And you want to make this, it's really easy, questions like that, to forget about the user. The user is the point of this thing. Keep that really, really important. And then you're going to talk about, okay, so what are the different goals people have? What are the current issues people have with it? And what are the best things we can do to tackle it? And you can also start talking to your interviewer about things like, what kind of improvements are we looking for here? Are we talking about things to make it more profitable or make it a better experience for people? And are we talking about, quick fixes or long-term, much, much bigger long-term things? And you probably want to talk about both of those, but you want to make it clear which ones you're talking about. If you come up with just quick fixes and your interviewer is thinking like, okay, but we want a bigger long-term thing, that's going to be a problem. But talk to your interviewer. Okay. I'll skip that one. Third type of product design question is favorite products. Never walk into a PM interview not having this down. So favorite products are going to be things like you're going to want to know for any interview, any PM interview, favorite mobile app, favorite physical product, favorite website, and favorite product from that company. You want to have answers prepared. These are such common questions. You should just have answers prepared for all of these. So what you want to do here is you're going to think about what problems does that product solve. Again, really, really think about that user there. Who is the user? The user is probably you. Unless maybe the interviewer asks it from a perspective of like, tell me about a product you think is really cool. That's where you could talk about a product that somebody else uses that isn't really you. But generally, it's going to be you as the user. You're going to talk about what are your goals, what are the major use cases, who are the other users. Make that user, again, very, very, very clear. Oops. What makes this product neat? I can't tell you how many people I have interviewed who give me an answer of, they tell me their favorite product is Uber, or favorite mobile app is Uber. Great. Why Uber, not Lyft? They don't have an answer. They don't have a reason they like one over the other. You want to, you want to be able to think about why that app? Why is that app so cool? Why is it better than its competitors? And you should generally know what the alternative products are. And then always know what you do to improve it. The big thing that people are missing here on their answers is typically insight. So let's take Uber as an example. Someone says their favorite product is Uber or Lyft, or whatever. And okay, cool, why? Why do you love it? Oh, it's great, I can order a taxi from, I can order a car from anywhere, and I don't need to pick up my phone, it's great. Cool. That's the same answer like my completely non-techie friends could have given, right? That is a valid answer and a valid explanation to why you love Uber or Lyft. That makes sense, but your goal is not to answer my questions by themselves. Your goal is to show me that you're a great PM. That answer did not communicate any insight. It's not the kind of thing that makes me think you're a good PM. A better answer, I had somebody tell me that their favorite app is Snapchat. This was a few years ago. And that's actually typically a very hard product to do for reasons I'll talk about in a few minutes. But when they start talking about it, they start talking about how communication is, in person, it's ephemeral. It's in transit, it goes away, and it makes people so much freer to how they communicate. And online, it's different. Everything's recorded, and it changes the way people talk about it. And when you listen to this woman talk, you could see that she had a depth of insight about the product that was beyond what a typical person out there would have. It wasn't cool, I could send funny photos because I don't need to worry about just the language, the vocabulary, and the depth. They were clearly thinking about it at a much deeper level. And that's the kind of insight you want to show. So when you think about your answers for your favorite product, ask yourself, could, insert whoever you know who's not at all technical, is this an answer that you might hear them give? And if it is, it's probably not helping your case as a PM. You want to show that insight. And this is the hardest thing to do on these answers. And by the way, as an interviewer, I actually don't love these questions because it's just, that insight is so random, I think, depending on whether or not somebody gives it. It's about preparation, and people approach questions different ways. I actually don't love it as an interviewer, but it's really, really important for you to prepare for that. So show that insight. Another thing to know here is just not all products are created equal. I see a lot of people decide, okay, their favorite website. Reddit is their favorite website. And then they get stuck in their mind on giving that as an answer. And it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to think about who are the users on Reddit and what are their use cases and how does Reddit do a really good job of solving these use cases. You definitely can, but it's harder. It's a harder path to do. By all means, if you are doing that path and you're doing it well, by all means, that is fantastic, wonderful, that's fine. But products that are really strictly social like that, I'd say products that are kind of wasting time sort of things, it tends to be harder for people to talk intelligently about use cases. Doesn't mean they're out there, it's just harder for people. So pick a product that, yes, you do love, and that shows that insight, that shows that ability to think about users and use cases. Don't just get stuck to whatever product you think about in the first place. The kind of wasting time social apps, they're harder problems to give, harder answers to give. Okay, so for all the things, for all your answers, know why do you love this? Who are the other users? There may well be other users, especially if you're thinking, if you do get answers about anything that's about a product for children or elderly, something like that, or disabled people, there's typically some other caretaker who's a user too. You want to think about them. Why do those other users love it? How does it compare to other products? And then what issues do you have with it, and how would you improve it? Make sure all your answers there, you know how to improve them. Okay, so prepare for those kind of favorite website, mobile product, those kind of things. Know for the broader product design questions. Or just be thinking about the key metrics around user engagement, referrals, things like that. Know those things. If you're interviewing for a company, be able to think about, suppose you're interviewing for Airbnb. What are the business priorities? What are their values? What are their strengths and weaknesses? And what are the things they care about? So they may care a ton about growth about user growth, and they may not be doing well, this is actually the case, but they may not be doing well in terms of revenue, but they may also not be a priority for them, right? So it's not just what are they doing well and what are they doing poorly in, it's what are they doing well in, and does that actually matter to them? What are they doing poorly in, and does that matter to them? Have a thought about what their priorities are. Okay, so I want to talk quickly about estimation questions. So these are the questions that are like, how would how many golf holes will fit a 747? How much would it cost to deliver pizzas everywhere in Manhattan? What else is the other type? And then there's things that are much more technical. How much money does Gmail make every year? So some people may have seen some articles in the last few years about like Google's banned these questions. They no longer ask these kind of brain teaser questions. That's totally false. Google absolutely still asks them, especially to product managers. They're very, very much standard questions. Either the person who's quoted or the media misquoted him. I don't know what happened, but the information is nonetheless wrong. Google absolutely still asks these questions, as do many, many other companies. They are not considered brain teaser questions, and which is fair. They're really, you may not like the questions, but they're really not brain teasers. They are problem-solving math questions. So lots of different types of these questions. The point of these questions is, yeah, to some extent, it's analytical skills, intelligence, smarts, no matter, depending on what word you want to put here. Ballparking skills is another thing people are looking for. One of the things as a PM is, you don't get to hire a $5 million consulting firm to go estimate the market size for this thing. That's not, or how much this thing would cost to do. And your job as a PM is kind of to ballpark certain things, and that's a skill that interviewers are specifically looking for. And then also just being generally comfortable with numbers and data. There's a lot of people in the world who are scared of numbers and scared of math, and are just like, oh, I'm not a math person, I can't do math. And a lot of companies don't want people like that. What it's not about is the final answer. For the most part, interviewers actually don't even know what the final answer is. Maybe some, out of curiosity, looked it up at some point, but most interviewers don't even know what the final answer is. It's really, really not about that. So what you want to do is ask questions. Again, every kind of non-behavioral questions, ask questions. Then get a structure for how you're going to do it. Often you want to make that explicit, but at least have a structure in your mind of how you're going to get there. Break down the different components, and then sanity check. So first thing, asking questions. So let's take a question I've asked many times. How many airplanes are in the air right now? What do we want to ask? What's that? Geography. Yeah, geography. Yeah, so over what area? Okay, so the US. What airline? Okay, all airlines. Type of plane, yeah, commercial, whatever. And so I ask this question a lot, and a lot of people will forget about, you ask a question, they'll think about commercial airlines, and they'll forget there's actually a ton of small passenger, like small little private planes. So you want to think about these kind of things. You want to ask questions about this. Look explicitly for that ambiguity. If there are assumptions you need to make, it's often okay to state, I'm going to assume we're talking about this thing. It's much better to make that assumption explicit than to make it and not make it clear to your interviewer. Then you want to come up with a structure for how you're going to do that. Okay, so if it's how many books are sold every year? Again, ask questions about what type of books. Does that include Kindle books? If it does include Kindle books, does that include free Kindle books? You said sold, so I don't know. Then one thing you want to think about here also is is there some other source of stuff? So for airplanes, there's the commercial airlines. There's also these like small private planes. For books, there's free downloads also. There's, textbooks. That might actually be a large portion of book sales. I don't know, but it could be. I've asked this book question a lot of times, and people will answer these questions about, people break down by income or education. I guess people will read about this number of books every year, blah, blah, and they'll go through this process. And one, they're not thinking about they're approaching it based on readership, but that's not book sales. It's fine to use readership as a metric, but you want to think about what portion of those are coming from the library, especially for heavy readers. But they totally forget about children's books. And as far as quantity of books, that could actually be very significant. So think about these other sources of data that might be changing things. Even if it's to a small extent, at least it's okay often to say like, well, there's this thing, but I'm going to ignore that because I don't think that's actually very significant. So then you're going to break down these different components. So you want to know how many books are sold every year. Okay, well, let's break it down by education level, and let's assume we're talking in the US. So we have people who have, let's say, high school degrees or less, college degrees, or advanced degrees. So I think about 70% of the US has a high school degree. I think about 25% have a college degree. And then maybe of those, maybe 5% have an advanced degree. Okay, so of people with advanced degrees, these people are most likely the most educated. They may be reading the most. They're also working the most. And so you start to move, you start to go through these. You're going to make assumptions. You're not just going to have data on everything. You're going to make assumptions. That's fine. Fine to make assumptions. What you want to be careful of here is you're going to need to use your own life in many, many cases. Unless you have data. You might have been reading. You might have come across some information about this, and that's about something related to that, and that's great. But often you're going to have to fall back on your own life. Be careful that it is your own life. You have a dramatically skewed population sample. I've seen people on the book question who say things like, they assume that the average American reads 6 books a month because they and their friends do, which I also find hard to believe. But certainly, the average American does not read 6 books a month. Like that is wildly off. And your interviewer generally isn't that concerned about if your assumptions are accurate. But when you make something that's clearly inaccurate, that's where it's more concerning. There was another person who was asked for some reason how many piano tuners there are in the U.S., like how many people are employed in that job. And this person assumed that one out of every 6 Americans has a grand piano. I mean, I don't know if I have any friends with grand pianos. I have 1 or 2, I guess, but certainly not 1 out of every 6 Americans has it. I mean, that's just, and when you hear answers like that, it's like, whoa, you're in this different world. But for the most part, interviewers are not that picky about that, but when it comes from your own life, be clear about that assumption. And then at the end, you sanity check. So you get this number that's like, let's say it was a Gmail, how much money does Gmail make? You come up with $6 billion in the US. You may not have a feel for if that sounds right or not, but do a quick sanity check. $6 billion, there are only 300 million people in the US. Even if every single person used Gmail, which is obviously not true, that would be an insane amount of money per person. And there's no way every single person uses Gmail in the US, obviously. So that will give you a feel for, okay, something went very wrong in your math, and then go back and check what happened. Was it a bad assumption? Was a bad way of breaking down the population? Whatever, go back and sanity check. Making big errors is usually not that big of a problem. It's about why did you make that error? If it's a little math error and your math was otherwise good, fine. If it was a ton of math errors just constantly, that may be a different issue. But go back and sanity check. And don't get too caught in the weeds here. These questions are usually 5, 10-minute problem-solving questions. Maybe they're not 30-minute exercises. So keep an eye on the time. Keep an eye on, practice these. If these are not questions, some people, these are very easy questions for them, and they kind of come naturally. If that's the case, there are other things to prepare. I wouldn't stress about it. But if this is the stuff that seems scary to you, then yeah, prep a little bit for these questions. Keep an eye on the time as you prep. It should be 5 to 10 minutes to move through this, not 30 minutes. Some people just try to break down too many things. When you think about breaking down the population, or breaking things down, whether it's population or whatever, use cases, what I generally find on most questions is one area will have a lot of depth to it, and the other areas won't have as much. If you're breaking down and doing a ton of work on every different component, you're probably getting too caught in something. So just keep an eye on that time. Okay, already went through this. Okay, so big mistakes people make here, getting caught in minor details. forgetting other sources of information. So that's the you forgot about the private planes. How much money does Gmail make every year? You forgot about people actually purchasing space. Easy mistake to make, but in the very beginning and at the end, think about, is there any other way that the value could be inflated here? And then making those crazy assumptions which suggests that you're just in a different world. So be careful for those things. Okay, last thing, case questions. So these are all over the map, so I'm not gonna talk a ton here, but what you wanna think about here is structuring answers. So even if you can't deliver great content, at least have a good structure, find a structure. Think about showing instinct here. One of the things that, if you've ever seen consulting interview prep is you ask these questions and then oh, why, yes, I do have the slide that shows exactly how much, different people buy of different products. PM cases aren't like that. It's what do you think? What do you think the problem would be? What do you think people would be most likely to purchase? It's very much based on your instincts, so use that. You want to, in all questions, product design, estimation questions, case questions, et cetera, you want to be the one driving the interview. So you should be the one who's fundamentally doing most of the talking. When it's your interviewer constantly, you saying one answer in your one sentence, and your interviewer having a question, and then you answer, that's usually a sign that you're not going into enough depth. So really drive that interview. And then just remember that it's all about the process you take here, not the final conclusion you come to in these answers. That goes for product design, that goes to case questions, estimation questions. It's always about that process, not the final conclusion is not really the point. Okay. I'm going to skip the launching stuff. I keep this stuff on the slides so that if you do want to go back and review them, you can still have that content. So I kind of keep this as a master slide deck. Okay, so key reminders, focus on the user. If all else fails, make it very, very clear that you are a person who thinks about the user. That's what you want to do at the end of the day. So I do have a lot more stuff in Cracking the PM interview. I have books sold around the corner. I don't know if I have any copies. I might have a few copies left there, but you can also get it online, of course. And then slides again, subject is PM prep, and that'll give you an auto response. And yeah, I guess I'll just keep that up there. I'll take one or two questions quickly before I think I have to probably release the room to somebody else.